Testing, testing. Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for the intro, B. Thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks to the organisers. Can you all hear me down the back okay? Can you understand the southern accent all right? I need more volume. How do I turn the volume up? Does anyone know?
Normally not the mic.
Peter!
Okay. Well, I don't know how to turn the volume up.
I'm
So.
sorry, what? Volume. I'll go and ask you if they can.
Okay. Well, I'll try and be as loud as I can.
Yeah, it sounds good right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm from New Zealand, as you know. I was just over visiting my 90-year-old dad in New Zealand. And he was a little boy during World War II. And they were terrified of the Japanese invasion. They had submarines in our harbours. Australia was being bombed. And most of our men were in North Africa fighting the Nazis. And if it hadn't been for the sacrifice of your fathers and uncles and grandfathers who stopped the Japanese army at the battles of Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea and Midway, my dad might not be here, and neither might I. So that's very personal, and I'm honoured to be here to say thank you to your country for giving me life. Now, right now I live in Florida. Has anybody heard of our governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis? Okay. So he's pretty good. We love him like chocolate down there. But I've got to, and I might say a couple of nice things later. Some of the things he's done that can be used up here. But I should reveal my relationship with Governor DeSantis, so you know, in the interest of transparency. You see, Governor DeSantis' family comes from Philadelphia, and my wife's family is also from Philly. And 40 years ago, my wife's Aunt Lizzie dated Ron DeSantis' father's cousin. So we're practically family. Just so you know. Right? Now, has anybody in the room ever had to undergo a background check or get a security clearance for a government or military position? So there's quite a few of you, quite a quarter of the room nearly. Is it true those background checks can be pretty darn rigorous? They might, they'll go through your family background, they'll check out your financial situation, they'll look for criminal convictions, they might interview your youth pastor, they might interview your high school teacher, youthful friends. They need to know that you're a trustworthy person who will defend the Constitution. Because one traitor can cost you a battle. One traitor can cost you your country. You imagine had Benedict Arnold been successful when he tried to betray the American Revolution. You might not have a country, folks. Well, now you've got tens of thousands of traitors in the country at federal, state and local level. What if you're a young Marxist radical who hangs around with the Communist Party, someone like, I don't know, like Keith Ellison or Ilhan Omar or Betty McCollum, and you get elected to Congress where you may serve on the Homeland Security Committee or the Armed Services Committee or even the Intelligence Committee. How much of a background check do you need for that one, folks? Zero. Nothing. There are no background checks in Congress or the Senate or even the White House now. Now, do you think maybe the Iranians have heard about this? And the Chinese and the Somalians and other enemies of the United States? But surely they wouldn't use that loophole against us, would they? But don't worry, don't panic, because, see, even if these traitors wanted to get to the government, there's no way they could, because we have an agency specifically designed to stop that happening, and that's the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Are you relieved now? Do you feel better?
No.
No. Once you would have, folks, once the FBI was an extremely professional and extremely patriotic organisation. Unfortunately, its leadership has gone well astray. But even if the FBI's leadership was good, the FBI has a very big problem that really diminishes its effectiveness. See, the FBI answers to the Judiciary Committee, the most powerful committee in the US Congress. Now, does anybody remember a congressman from Michigan called John Conyers? He was in Congress from 1965 to 2017, and he was the chairman or the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee for 40 years. He oversaw the Justice Department and the FBI for that long. He was the man who abolished your House Un-American Activities Committee, one of your last lines of defense against internal subversion. John Conyers had a 50-year history with the Communist Party USA. He was working for Moscow most of his career. He was a founder member of Democratic Socialists of America, the major Marxist group now operating in this state. And he was a supporter of the Workers' World Party, which supports North Korea and Cuba and Iran. And he was also a big-time supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I'm sure a lot of people here know what the Muslim Brotherhood is. Anybody here who doesn't know what it is? Well, I'll just reiterate, it's a semi-secret society, started in Egypt in 1929, goal of worldwide Islam. They worked with the Nazis during World War II, then they worked with the Soviet KGB. They worked with the KGB to set up ISIS, to set up the Palestine Liberation Organization, Hamas, and other terrorist groups. But in this state, they work legally through the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, and the Muslim Student Association, which has chapters in virtually every college in your state. And when some of your Republican Congress members, including Michelle Bachmann, tried to get the Muslim Brotherhood designated as a terrorist organization, John Conyers pushed back. You watch him on C-SPAN. No, we shouldn't go after the Muslim Brotherhood. They're a peaceful social service agency now. We should work with them, not against them. John Conyers was a hardcore anti-American Marxist-Leninist, working for Moscow while overseeing the FBI and the Justice Department. Now, we've got Jim Jordan as the chairman now, thankfully, but up until recently, you had a couple of interesting characters on that committee. You had Judy Chu from California, long-time supporter of the Communist Workers' Party. She runs the Chinese communities of Southern California for the CCP. She's basically their agent. You also had the past chairman of the Judiciary Committee. You've seen him on TV. You'll recognize him instantly. He takes up the whole screen. That's Jerry Nadler from New York.
Yeah.
Okay? The man who tried to impeach President Trump twice. Well, Jerry Nadler was also a long-time card-carrying member of Democratic Socialists of America. He is a Marxist. And think about this, John Conyers was a DSA member and he chaired the committee. Then Jerry Nadler took over and guess what? He too was a DSA member. What a coincidence. See, this is Lenin, this is revolution. Lenin said, it is not the gaining of power that's important, it is the keeping of power that's important. If they get that position, they're going to keep that position. Now, I'm going to say this is a bit of a fantasy thing here. People sometimes get excited by this, but this is just make-believe, so don't get carried away. One day, the FBI wakes up and they think our country is in trouble. We've got at least 100 members of the Congress who couldn't pass a background check. We've got another 40 senators who couldn't either. They are working with the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Cubans, the Muslim Brotherhood, and several globalist organisations. They are the reason that Iran's about to get the nuclear weapon. They are the reason our southern border is deliberately wide open. They are the reason our military is being destroyed before our very eyes. They are the reason that big tech can censor us. They are the reason that China can buy anything it wants here, including a lot of our politicians. They are the reason our kids are being indoctrinated and perverted in schools. All of this comes down to the traitors in Congress. We better darn well do something while we still have a country. Let's go. Let's go, says the FBI. Let's go to the Judiciary Committee. Let's talk to our bosses about this problem. Mrs. Chu, Mr. Nadler, we need to investigate at least 100 of your Democratic colleagues for working against America. Do you mind? And by the way, Mrs. Chu, by the way, Mr. Nadler, you're both on the list. Is that all right? What do you think's going to happen to their budget next year, folks? What's going to happen to their pensions and their jobs if they pull that one? Do you think the FBI is stupid enough to bite the hand that feeds it?
No.
So there's no background checks at all in Congress. The media will not go after you when you're on the left, and the FBI doesn't dare to touch you. That is why half of your Congress, no, 40% of your Congress and 40% of your Senate are basically working for the other team. They've sold this country out. Trump's intelligence advisor, Ratcliffe, said 3 years ago, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, now controls so many American Congress members, they can determine which legislation goes through the Congress and which doesn't. That's not including the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Russians, or the Cubans. It's just the CCP. But at least we have a moderate president. At least Joe Biden's a moderate for a change. He's bringing the country together. He's ending the division and the extremism. Isn't this wonderful? That's what they told us. And that's how they sold him. He's an old-fashioned, working-class, common-sense Democrat. How's that been working out, people? Well, if you want to know Joe Biden's communist background, you look at my book, White House Reds. Joe Biden was put in place by a pro-Soviet communist group that was electing senators to gut the US military. He has worked with the Iranians since the 70s and the Chinese since the 2000s. You know, we forget that in the 80s, when Reagan was battling communism, that he had 3 major enemies in the US Senate. He had Ted Kennedy, he had Joe Biden, and he had John Kerry, otherwise known as Jane Fonda with less testosterone. They were the 3. They were absolute pro-communist, all 3 of them.
Yeah.
But he was sold to us as a moderate. Okay? So, but I want to talk about his cabinet. And I want to talk about one in particular. His whole cabinet is Marxist. Miguel Cadrona, education, Marxist, Maoist. Julie Su, who's going to be confirmed as Labour soon, Maoist. Little Pete Buttigieg, Gramsci is communist. His father was one of the top communists in the world. He's transportation. He's just moved to Michigan to run for the US Senate from Michigan. They're all Marxists, but I want to choose one who shows really how bad this is. Does anybody know who the US Secretary of the Interior is?
Is that Janet Yellen?
No, that's Treasury.
Indigenous
Secretary of the Interior, one who looks after all your public lands.
American Indian.
Deb Haaland, lest you got that. Deb Haaland, Native American from New Mexico. She was a second-term congresswoman who nobody had ever heard of, including all of you, who became US Secretary of the Interior. This is how it happened, and this is why it's a problem. Now, what was the very first thing that Uncle Joe Biden did when he got into the White House?
Shut down the Keystone.
Shut down the Keystone Pipeline. 11,000 American jobs just gone zip. Couldn't we do with a little bit of that energy right now, folks? Well, it happened allegedly because Native Americans were protesting in the Dakotas, right? And all these protesters, they had camps up there and Standing Rock and all this. Well, all those protests were organised by a woman called Judith LeBlanc, a Native American from Oklahoma, a member of the Caddo tribe, a leader of the Native Organisers Alliance, and a standing member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party USA. So the communists organised it, and Biden did what he was told, shut it all down. Then Judith LeBlanc did big voter registration and get out the vote drives on the Native American reservations of Minnesota, of Montana, of New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. All states that sort of could have gone either way, and the Native American vote could make the difference. Because the Native Americans normally vote Democrat, but they vote in low numbers. So Judith LeBlanc organised big voter registration drives for all of these people. She organised a presidential forum for Native Americans in Sioux City, Iowa, big national event, totally done by the Communist Party USA. So, as a reward for this great work, Judith LeBlanc was allowed to nominate her very good friend and fellow Marxist, Deb Haaland, as US Secretary of the Interior. And of course nobody knew who she was, so they had to make her known. So they mounted a campaign, and they had buses and badges, and they had celebrity endorsements and Facebook ads. It was Deb for Interior, Deb for Interior. They had Alyssa Milano got on board. Sarah Silverman got on board. Mark Ruffalo, Hanoi Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, Cher, whole bunch of celebrities. Deb for Interior. And she was nominated, and she was elected with 4 Republican Senate votes. Well, I say Republican for want of a better word, Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, all the 4, right, the Rhino Republican senators. Now she is Secretary of the Interior. She controls 20% of America. She controls all the Native American reservations. She controls all the public lands, border areas, most of Alaska, most of the western states, and most importantly, all of the energy extraction on those public lands. All of the drilling and fracking, all of the uranium on Native American lands, it's all under her purview. And she is shutting down every single lease she possibly can. While Biden is going out buying energy from your enemies, Venezuela and Iran, she is shutting down every single thing she can, because the Communist Party USA works for China and Putin's Russia. You've basically got an agent of Putin and Xi as the Secretary of the Interior, and she is doing their bidding. Every time you pay for gas at the pump, the price you pay is because of Joe Biden and Deb Haaland and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, basically. Now, she was testified before your Congress, before your Senate last week, and she publicly said her job is to help make Americans poorer to cope with climate change. She wants to make you poorer. Have you ever seen a US cabinet member say her job is to make Americans poorer?
No.
Well, look it up. This is what happens when you have no internal security. You get malicious people with great power. She's only one of them, but she's one of the more obvious. Now, on the international stage, I want to say a couple of things about one thing that I think you're already probably partially aware of. but I want to give you a more depth on it. Now, in May 2019, President Trump put tariffs on Chinese goods. And the Xinhua news agency, the communist news agency, publicly said our response to America's aggression is to declare people's war on the United States. So what does people's war mean? People say, well, they put tariffs on American goods. What does it mean? People's war is a term from Mao Zedong, the Chinese revolutionary. It means to destroy your enemy through unconventional methods before your soldiers even march. So they're marching into a destroyed country. People's war is 80,000 kids dead from fentanyl in the last year. That's deliberate Chinese people's war. People's war is Black Lives Matter, a Chinese operation. People's war is buying your politicians, buying your farmlands, putting Chinese factories in your areas right next to military bases. It's flying balloons over your nuclear bases so that when they nuke them, they know exactly where to place their nukes. That is why they put that balloon over there, folks. People's war is TikTok. People's war is the control of Hollywood. People's war is stealing your technology. All of this is people's war. It is also undermining your industry by flooding your country with cheap crap that you can buy in Walmart. That's people's war. And it is also biological warfare. Now, I cannot prove that the COVID was released when it was to deliberately hurt President Trump in election year. I think it's only about 99.99998% certain at this point. But it is 100% certain that when the COVID was out there, they deliberately spread it to this country and other Western countries. So it's election year, right? And President Trump's cruising for election. And the CCP knows that if he gets 4 more years, he's going to bring them down. They got one chance to take him out. One chance. So they put everything into it. So the COVID comes along. And President Trump's thinking, what are we going to do about this? You know, Fauci's telling me, and the World Health Organization is telling me there's going to be 2 million dead before Christmas if I don't get on top of this. 2 million Americans dead. He's thinking of that, but he's also thinking, what's that going to do to the election? So he followed the advice to shut things down, because if he hadn't, he would have got blamed for every dead grandmother in the country in election year. He really had no choice. So shut it all down and devastated the economy, wrecked, just devastated businesses, lives all over the place, set the stage for Black Lives Matter, another Chinese operation to come on top of that. But you got to think back, who controls the World Health Organization that drove these policies?
China.
That is the Communist Party of China. The head of the World Health Organization is Mr. Tedros from Ethiopia. Now, Mr. Tedros was not even a medical doctor. He's an academic, a former student Maoist, and the leader of Ethiopia's pro-Chinese Communist Party. He was handpicked by the CCP. Now, the World Health Organization has a very important unit. It's called the Behavioral Modification Unit. Now, what do you think that sounds like, folks? Whose behavior do they want to modify? It is you. They want to make you love masks. They want to make you love lockdowns and vaccinations and all of the things. And they do not want you to love ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or herd immunity or vitamin D therapy or any of the other alternatives. Well, the head of that unit is a woman called Susan Mickey from the United Kingdom. And she's a social psychologist, an expert on social psychology. She has done smoking cessation programs for the Chinese government. She is a big fan of the Chinese approach to COVID. She was Boris Johnson's key advisor when he locked down Britain. He was a conservative, but he followed her advice, and she was known as the mask Nazi. She said we may have to wear masks for the rest of our lives. She was zero COVID all the way. The only possible approach to COVID was complete lockdowns for as long as it took, compulsory mask wearing for as long as it took, and vaccines. Susan Mickey is also a lifelong member of the Communist Party of Britain. She was so extreme in the Communist Party, they used to call her Stalin's nanny. Wasn't just a communist, she was a Stalinist. When the Soviet tanks suppressed the revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1968, she cheered on the tanks. They called her a tanky. She is so extreme. Now you know that President Biden wants to sign you up to protocol with the World Health Organization that gives him complete control over all future health emergencies. You've heard about this? Most other countries have already signed up. Biden's trying to push it through. So what happens in the next health emergency, the next pandemic? Health emergency could also be guns. It could also be hate speech. It also could be religious teaching of children. It can be a whole bunch of things. It's almost anything they decide. But the point is, we won't get to decide the response. That response will be decided in Geneva and Beijing by Susan Mickey and Tedros and Xi Jinping. It is selling complete sovereignty of the United States to Communist China if this is allowed to go ahead. They'll be able to lock down our economies, shut down our states, whatever they want to do, and we'll have no say in the matter whatever. Thankfully, South Carolina is standing against this. I think Florida is going to ban this, but it's a problem, big problem. Now, Minnesota, okay? How did this beautiful state get so darn communist? It's a wonderful paradise that you have in the north. What great place to live, great people, except for the communists. It's great. But, so how did this happen? Why did Minnesota get so far down the road? Well, normally when you have a Midwestern state, you have conservative rural areas and you have sort of liberal city areas. And in a lot of states, there's enough, like Nebraska, there's enough rural people to balance, to overwhelm the city socialists. But there's a couple of things that happened that had a big impact on the state. In 1848, there was a communist revolution in Germany, and it failed. And the German authorities chased thousands of German communists out of the country, or executed them or arrested them. And where did they go to? They went to Milwaukee, Chicago, and Minneapolis. And they started socialist parties in all of those big cities. And then they started the Communist Party in 2019. So you had that socialist presence here right through the 1860s, 1880s, 1870s in the big cities. Now, in 1905, there was another failed communist revolution, this time in Russia. They rose against the Tsar crushed him, and thousands of communists fled the country. And Finland was part of the Russian Empire then. And Finland had a very, very strong communist movement. And where do you think thousands of Finns went to, people?
Northern Minnesota.
Northern Minnesota, the Iron Range. You got a massive influx of communist Finns. By 1913, a third of the Finnish population on the Iron Range was communist. By the 1920s, 40% of the Communist Party nationwide was of Finnish extraction. The head of the Communist Party for decades, thank you so much, the head of the Communist Party for decades was of course Gus Hall, who was an Iron Range Finn from right up in the north there. Well, so, yeah, that's exactly. I've been to his little town where he was born. So you had this country area that should have been conservative, but was full of communists, and they had communist labour halls. They had communist co-ops, the Masaba Co-op. They had communist newspapers and communist coffee companies and communist bakeries and communist opera houses. You name it, the whole Iron Range was permeated by communism. Now, in 1918, the socialists set up the Farmer Labour Party in this state. And it took hold, especially in the north. It was a populist farmer labour, you know, the poor farmers joining together with the miners and the labourers, and it kicked off. And they elected 3 governors of the state. They elected a whole bunch of senators, a whole bunch of Congress members, a whole bunch of state reps, mayors. They dominated, especially the northern part of the state, for several decades. They elected a man called John Bernard on their ticket. He went to Congress. He was a full Communist Party member, served in Congress for a couple of years. You know, did a whole bunch of communist votes up there. Well, by the late 30s, the Communist Party, through the Farmer Labour Party, basically ran much of this state. They were very, very close to Alma Benson, the left-wing governor of your state at the time. In 1944, Alma Benson and Hubert Humphrey, who had a deep communist background, joined together with the Farmer Labour Party to set up what you now know as the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labour Party. Hubert Humphrey pretended he was an anti-communist, but he was part of the Works Progress Administration, which was set up completely by communists, trained communists. He was also very good friends of a woman called, I think it was Rosemary Stone. I've just forgotten her name right now. Rosemary Stone something. She was a full-on Communist Party member from the Twin Cities, very close personal friend for many years of Hubert Humphrey, who later became your vice president. So after the war, the Communist Party got under a lot of pressure from the House Un-American Activities Committee. It started to fade, but most of them just went into the DFL. Most of them didn't give up communism, they just moved into the DFL. And the Communist Party, even up to the 2000s, when it was down to maybe 30 members in the state, still had massive influence. Their leader, Erwin Marquette, held 3 fundraisers in his home for a young aspiring congressman named Keith Ellison. He got Keith Ellison elected. Another one of the communists in the state, Mark Fromke, who's whirly up Brainerd Way, works a lot in North Dakota and the sugar mills and that kind of thing. Very close friends of Mark Dayton, your former governor. Very, very close to Al Franken, very close to Amy Klobuchar, Rick Nolan, who was your Congress member for a while, and Colin Peterson as well. So the communists still had influence, and they